Get ready to be terrified with these 3 true and scary camping horror stories. Whether you're an outdoor enthusiast or just love a good scare, these stories will keep you on edge long after the campfire has died out. I was 19 when I decided to go on a camping trip with my boyfriend in the Scottish Highlands. We were young, reckless, and thirsty for adventure. We chose a secluded spot, away from the usual tourist sites, seeking an authentic experience in the wild. Little did we know that this decision would lead us to one of the most terrifying nights of our lives. The day was coming to an end when we finally found the perfect spot to pitch our tent. It was a small valley surrounded by heather-covered hills, with a crystal-clear stream meandering nearby. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and vegetation. As we set up our camp, I couldn't help but notice the oppressive silence that hung over the area. There were no bird songs or other animal sounds, just the occasional whisper of the wind through the plants. As the sun set, a fine mist started to form, enveloping our tent in a cold, damp embrace. My boyfriend decided to collect more firewood for our campfire, leaving me alone for a moment. I stepped into the tent, lit my lantern, and picked up a book, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of unease settling in my stomach. The book's pages couldn't capture my attention. My eyes kept drifting to the shadows dancing on the tent walls, cast by the flickering light of the lantern. The silence outside seemed to have intensified, as if nature itself was holding its breath. That was when I heard the first strange sound of faint dragging, as if something was cautiously moving around our tent. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself that it was just my boyfriend returning with the firewood, or maybe a curious animal, but something inside me knew it wasn't anything so innocent. The scary camping stories we heard as children suddenly didn't seem so fictional anymore. I was about to experience my own outdoor horror story, a real-life tale of terror that would be etched into my memory forever. The dragging sound continued, circling our tent with a methodical precision that chilled me to the bone. My breath caught in my throat as I struggled to remain silent, fearful that any sound might attract the attention of whatever was out there. The book in my hands trembled, and I gently closed it, setting it aside. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening, amplifying each beat of my racing heart. I desperately wondered where my boyfriend was and why he was taking so long to return. The lantern flickered as if sensing my fear, and for one terrifying moment, I thought it would leave me in total darkness. That was when I noticed something strange happening to the tent's ceiling. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it started to bow inward. My eyes widened in horror as I realized it was descending, as if an invisible force was pressing down from above. Within seconds, the ceiling had lowered by about 2 feet, forcing me to lie down to avoid contact. Heart in my throat, I fixed my gaze on the taut fabric of the tent. That was when I saw something that made me question my own sanity. 10 distinct points appeared on the ceiling, pressing downward as if they were invisible fingers. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It seemed as though someone or something was pushing down on the tent's ceiling with both hands. The terror I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the fantastical fear of imaginary monsters or ghost stories told around the campfire. It was a true, visceral horror, born from the certainty that something inexplicable and potentially dangerous was happening. My mind screamed for rational explanations, but none presented themselves. I was living through a scary camping experience that defied logic. Paralyzed by fear, I watched as the finger marks slowly moved across the tent ceiling, or someone. My body shook uncontrollably, and I struggled to control my breathing, fearing that the slightest sound would give away my position. The real horror stories I had dismissed as exaggerations now seemed terribly plausible. Suddenly, I heard a distant scream. It was my boyfriend's voice, laden with panic and urgency. "Run!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the valley. In an instant, the finger marks disappeared from the tent ceiling, which sprang back to its original position. The momentary relief was quickly replaced by a new wave of terror. What had happened to him? Driven by fear and adrenaline, I threw myself out of the tent. The darkness outside was almost tangible, with the mist thickening and obscuring the landscape. My lantern sliced through the gloom like a knife, revealing fragments of the scene around me. That was when I saw a figure moving swiftly between the trees, running towards me. My heart pounded as I recognized my boyfriend. His face was pale with fear, his eyes wide with dread. "We have to get out of here now," he panted, grabbing my arm. I had no time to ask questions. We started running, leaving behind our tent and all our belongings. The outdoor terror we were experiencing was real and immediate. As we ran through the rugged terrain, tripping over stones and bushes, I heard the sounds of pursuit behind us, heavy footsteps and labored breathing, too close for my comfort. I glanced back briefly and saw a dark silhouette moving among the trees, larger and faster than any animal I knew. This was not a paranormal encounter with some supernatural entity, but something equally terrifying. We were being hunted by something very real and very dangerous. Our lungs burned as we ran through the dark night, adrenaline fueling each desperate stride. The dense mist hindered our vision, turning trees and rocks into menacing shadows. The sounds of pursuit continued, sometimes seeming to lessen only to resurge with renewed vigor, as if our pursuer was toying with us. Between gasps for breath, my boyfriend managed to tell me what he had seen. While collecting firewood, he had spotted a tall, shadowy figure watching him from a distance. Initially, he thought it was another camper, but when he tried to approach, the figure moved with inhuman speed and agility. That was when he realized we were in danger and ran back to warn me. We stumbled upon a shallow stream, the icy water soaking our clothes. The intense cold was a shock, but it also gave us a moment of clarity. We realized we needed a plan beyond just running. We spotted a rocky formation ahead and decided to hide, hoping our pursuer would pass us by in the darkness. We squeezed into a small crevice between the rocks, struggling to control our ragged breathing. The minutes dragged like hours as we waited, each sound of the forest amplified by our fear. This scary camping experience was testing the limits of our courage and sanity. Suddenly, we heard heavy footsteps approaching. We froze, barely daring to breathe. An enormous shadow loomed past our hiding place, so close that I could smell the sweat and something more primal, almost animalistic. For one terrible moment, I thought we had been discovered, but the figure continued on, disappearing into the mist. We waited a few more minutes before daring to move, our bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. The rest of the night was a blur of frenzied hiking, always alert for any sound of pursuit. When the sun finally rose, we found a road and managed to flag down a passing driver for help. Only then, seated in the car of a kind stranger heading back to civilization, did we allow the reality of what we had lived through to fully sink in. We never discovered exactly what or who had pursued us on that terrible night. Local authorities mentioned rumors of a violent hermit living in the mountains, but nothing was confirmed. Whatever it was, it turned what should have been a simple camping trip into one of the truly scary stories I will carry with me forever. That night in the Scottish Highlands taught me that sometimes the deepest terror doesn't come from the supernatural, but from the unknown lurking in the shadows of the real world. I never imagined that my passion for camping would bring me face to face with true horror. That night in Nederland, Colorado will forever be etched in my memory as one of the scariest camping experiences I've ever had. I was a solitary adventurer, seeking the peace and tranquility of the Rocky Mountains, far from the hustle of the city. The day started like any other. I woke up early, had my hearty breakfast, and set out on a long hike through the winding trails of the region. The fresh mountain air filled my lungs, and the bird's song was my only company. As the sun began to set, I decided to set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by tall, imposing pine trees. As I pitched my tent, I couldn't help but notice the silence that seemed to intensify around me. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, awaiting something. I shook my head, brushing off these thoughts. After all, I was there to relax, not scare myself with imaginary horror stories. As night fell, I lit a small campfire. The flames danced, casting restless shadows on the trees surrounding me. I sat on a fallen log, warming my hands over the fire and gazing up at the stars that were starting to dot the dark sky. That was when I heard it, a twig snapping in the darkness beyond the campfire's light. My heart quickened, but I tried to calm myself. It was probably just a wild animal, curious about my presence, but something in the back of my mind told me otherwise. The sound of approaching footsteps made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and then, emerging from the shadows like a specter, appeared a figure that chilled me to the bone. The figure that stepped out of the darkness froze my blood. He was a man, tall and bulky, wearing a dark, dirty boiler suit. But what truly terrified me was what covered his face, a beekeeper's hood, white and opaque, hiding his features completely. In his right hand he held a large hunting knife, its blade glinting in the firelight in a sinister way. I stood paralyzed, my body refusing to move as the stranger calmly walked between my tent and the campfire. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the soft thud of his boots on the ground. My mind screamed for me to run, but my muscles wouldn't respond. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. The intruder didn't utter a word, nor did he make any overtly threatening gestures. He simply continued on his way, passing by me as if I wasn't even there. The smell of sweat and earth that clung to him reached my nostrils, bringing with it a wave of nausea and fear. I could feel his gaze through that white mask, studying me, assessing me. When he finally passed me and started to move away toward the forest on the other side of the clearing, my muscles relaxed a little. But the relief was momentary. Just before he disappeared completely into the shadows, the man stopped and turned his head in my direction. Even without seeing his eyes, I could feel the intensity of his stare. It was in that moment that I realized this wasn't just any scary story. It was real. It was happening to me. The true horror of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I was alone, unarmed, facing a potentially dangerous stranger in the middle of the wilderness. The scary camping stories we used to tell around the campfire seemed like child's play compared to this. My mind began to race, searching for a way out, a way to survive this terrifying encounter in the camp. With my heart hammering in my chest, I watched the stranger disappear into the darkness of the forest. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and my ragged breathing. My mind was in chaos, torn between the need to act and the paralyzing fear that held me in place. Finally, I managed to move. With trembling hands, I started to gather my things as quickly as I could. Every sound in the forest startled me. Imagining the masked man's return, the outdoor terror I was experiencing was something I could never have anticipated or prepared for. As I packed, my eyes constantly scanned the darkness around me. The shadows seemed to move, and every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. It was as if the entire forest had transformed into a setting for real horror stories, with dangers lurking in every dark corner. I decided not to take down the tent. It would be too noisy and time-consuming. I grabbed only the essentials: my backpack, flashlight, and cell phone. Unfortunately, there was no signal in that remote area. I was on my own, facing one of the scariest moments of my life. With one last look at the camp, I plunged into the darkness of the forest, heading in the opposite direction from where the stranger had gone. My plan was to reach the main road, hoping to find help, or at least a spot with cell service. Every step was a challenge, with branches snapping under my feet and the constant fear of being followed. This scary camping experience was far from over, and I knew the night would be long and terrifying. The darkness of the forest enveloped me as I pushed forward, tripping over roots and rocks, with my heart in my throat. Every sound made me whirl around, expecting to see that white mask emerging from the shadows. The fear of the unknown, of what might be lurking, was almost unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, I caught a glimpse of light through the trees. I quickened my pace, hoping it was the road, but as I drew closer, I realized it was just another clearing, illuminated by moonlight. And that was when I heard them. Footsteps, heavy and determined, heading in my direction. I froze, holding my breath. The hooded figure emerged from the shadows, the hunting knife still in his hand, reflecting the moonlight. He stopped a few meters away from me, his stance menacing. In that moment, I knew there was nowhere left to run. This was the climax of my camping terror, the confrontation I had feared. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I did the only thing I could. I screamed. I screamed with all the force of my lungs, a primal sound of fear and challenge. The man hesitated, seemingly surprised by my reaction. Taking advantage of this moment of confusion, I grabbed a thick branch from the ground and held it up like a weapon. What followed was a tense, silent standoff. We both stood there, assessing each other, waiting for the other's next move. And then I heard something unexpected. Distant voices and the sound of flashlights cutting through the darkness. Apparently, my scream had attracted the attention of other campers in the area. The masked man looked in the direction of the sounds and without hesitation, turned and disappeared into the forest as silently as he had appeared. I stood there, trembling, until a group of campers found me. I explained the situation in halting words, still in shock. The authorities were called, but the man was never found. That night taught me that sometimes, truly scary stories aren't about ghosts or monsters, but about the very real dangers that can be found in the most unexpected places. My scary camping experience ended without bloodshed, but it left invisible scars that I carry to this day. Nature can be beautiful, but it can also hide terrors that defy our understanding. The invitation to the camping trip came as a welcome surprise. I, a 23-year-old biology student, was eager to escape the stifling routine of city life. My unruly brown hair and tired green eyes reflected the accumulated stress of the semester. When my classmates suggested a camping trip in the mountains of the Cordillera, I saw it as the perfect opportunity to reconnect with nature and, perhaps, with myself. We were an eclectic group of 5. Myself, 2 classmates, and 2 of their friends whom I hadn't met before. As I packed my backpack, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. After all, the mountains were known for their scary camping stories, but I was determined not to let fear get the better of me. On the day of our departure, the sky was cloudy, as if reflecting my own uncertainty. As we gathered at the meeting point, I closely observed my travel companions. There was something about the expression of one of them, a tall, lanky guy with restless eyes, that made me uncomfortable. But I brushed off this feeling as mere pre-trip jitters. The journey to our camping spot was long and winding. As we ascended the mountains, the vegetation grew denser and the air thinner. The silence, occasionally broken by the sound of branches cracking under the wheels of our car, created a suspenseful atmosphere that I couldn't quite explain. We arrived at the clearing as the sun was setting. The site was secluded, surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to touch the sky. As we set up our tents, I couldn't help but notice how the shadows lengthened, creating strange shapes on the forest floor. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized we were truly alone in this remote place, vulnerable to whatever the night might bring. As night fell, our group gathered around the newly lit campfire. The dancing flames cast restless shadows on the trees around us, setting the perfect stage for scary camping stories. My companions began to share their most spine-chilling experiences, each tale more hair-raising than the last. The restless-eyed guy whom I'd noticed earlier remained strangely quiet. His gaze fixed on the flames made me uncomfortable. When it was his turn to tell a story, he hesitated for a moment before starting in a low, trembling voice. "Have you ever heard about the disappearances in the mountains of the Cordillera?" A heavy silence fell upon the group. He went on to describe a series of inexplicable incidents involving campers who were never seen again. His words painted a vivid picture of outdoor terror that sent my heart racing. I looked at the faces of the others, illuminated by the flickering fire, and saw my own fear reflected in their eyes. When the stories ended, we all retired to our tents. The silence of the forest was deafening, interrupted only by the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Lying in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The scary stories echoed in my mind, turning every sound of nature into a potential threat. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by a strange noise. It seemed to come from outside my tent, a sound of branches breaking, as if someone was moving stealthily around our camp. My heart raced. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the unease grew with each passing second. Mustering my courage, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The full moon bathed the clearing in a pale, ghostly light. That was when I saw a figure moving between the trees. It was the restless-eyed guy, and he appeared to be carrying something in his hands. Something that glinted in the moonlight, something that looked eerily like a knife. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched the shadowy figure move through the trees. The moonlight reflected off the blade in his hands, confirming my worst fears. Silently, I stepped out of my tent, my bare feet touching the cold forest floor. I needed to alert the others, but I feared that any sound might attract the attention of the armed man. With cautious steps, I approached the nearest tent. Before I could reach it, I heard a muffled scream coming from the opposite direction. Panic gripped me as I realized one of us had already been attacked. The real horror stories we had shared earlier now seemed like a sinister premonition of the horror we were living through. Without a second thought, I ran into the forest, my survival instinct taking over. Branches and stones cut my bare feet, but adrenaline blocked out the pain. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps and the labored breathing of my pursuer. This scary camping experience had turned into a real-life nightmare, a true camping terror that I could never have imagined. The darkness of the forest was oppressive, only occasionally broken by beams of moonlight filtering through the treetops. Every shadow seemed to hide a danger, every sound a harbinger of death. My mind raced with frenzied thoughts about my companions. Were they alive? Had they managed to escape? Suddenly, my foot slipped on a wet rock and I fell, rolling down a small slope. I landed with a thud, the air knocked out of my lungs. For a moment I lay paralyzed, certain that my pursuer would catch up to me. But then I heard something that froze my blood. Voices. Multiple voices, coming from all directions. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse. It was an organized hunt, and I was the prey. The voices drew closer, echoing through the dark forest. My heart was pounding so hard I feared it would give me away. Lying motionless on the damp ground, I tried to control my ragged breathing. The truly scary stories we had shared around the campfire now seemed like a macabre prelude to this night of terror. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the darkness, passing mere inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying I wouldn't be discovered. The voices grew louder, and I could distinguish scattered words. "Find him. He can't escape. Finish this." The fear paralyzed me, turning every second into an eternity of anguish. Just when I thought I couldn't bear the tension any longer, I heard a distant scream. It was a familiar voice, one of my camping companions. The sound was followed by a commotion, and the voices and lights quickly moved away in the direction of the scream. I seized the opportunity to get up and run in the opposite direction. Ignoring the pain in my bruised feet, I ran aimlessly through the forest, guided only by my survival instinct. The sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, bringing with the dawn's light a new wave of terror. What if my pursuers found me in the daylight? The ghost stories and scary encounters I knew of paled in comparison to this real-life horror I was experiencing. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, I stumbled upon a small clearing. To my shock and relief, I saw my camping companions gathered there, including the restless-eyed guy. They all looked scared but unharmed. Before I could speak, a group of uniformed men emerged from the forest. "It's all right now," one of them said, approaching us. "We're the local police. We received a report about a dangerous fugitive in this area and came to investigate." The realization of what had happened hit me like a bolt. This wasn't a planned attack, but a police search that had coincided with our camping trip. The stalker I had seen was actually a police officer on patrol. Our own horror stories and the eerie atmosphere of the forest had fueled our fears, turning an ordinary night into a scary camping experience. As the sun rose, illuminating the clearing, I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. The true horror wasn't in imaginary monsters or supernatural dangers, but in the way our fears could distort reality, transforming shadows into threats and innocent sounds into portents of peril. That night, in the mountains of the Cordillera, taught us a valuable lesson about the nature of fear and the importance of keeping a calm mind In stressful situations, as we packed up our camp, we vowed to never again underestimate the power of our own minds in creating the most terrifying of horrors. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.